If you stay invested for longer, your returns can be higher. BSE Investors Protection Fund.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 16th edition of BusinessLine Knowledge Series of webinars. We have with us Dr. Subramanian today, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. Dr. Subramanian needs no introduction, but just to be doubly sure, I'm going to read out a very quick bio of Dr. Subramanian for the benefit of all of you. Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian is currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and he is a leading expert on economic policy, banking, and corporate governance. He is a PhD from Chicago Booth and a top-ranking IIM alumnus. He has authored the economic survey that recommends ethical wealth creation for prosperous India. This particular iteration of the survey was well appreciated by people in the profession and across the country. By integrating India's rich economic and spiritual heritage with modern economic ideas, Dr. Subramanian makes wealth creation through a marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of trust. So with that, I now move on to Dr. Subramanian. And my apologies for this delayed start, which was due to unavoidable circumstances. Dr. Subramanian, let's start with reaction to the Q1 GDP results, which came out a few weeks ago.
Your voice is breaking a lot. I'm not able to hear your questions properly. Even the video and audio both are breaking a lot.
Is it better now?
Yeah, now much better.
Yeah. So you've gone on record saying that despite the 23%, 24% contraction in the economy in the first quarter, we are well on track for a V-shaped recovery. Now, can you share with us what is the basis for your optimism and what is the grounding for your thesis of V-shaped recovery?
Raghu, as always, every statement that I make is driven just by data and careful data analysis. I wrote a piece in the Indian Express that got published on Tuesday, where I looked at the relationship between the GDP decline in the April to June quarter across countries, and looked at the relationship of that with the intensity of the lockdown. Globally, there was a lockdown in the month of April and May, and as the Oxford University has been tracking, India had a very intense lockdown, which itself, was required by the nature of, our country, large population, very high population density. And so, the pandemic spread, the pace of that can be very high. So, that chart very clearly shows that, India lies on the line of fit. So clearly the GDP decline is because of the intensity of the lockdown. Also, if you look at, that particular relationship, the United States and Brazil stand out as positive outliers on growth, but that has come with enormous cost that they've paid in terms of human lives. The two countries with the maximum number of deaths. If you look on a per capita basis as well, in terms of the number of deaths, India has 5 per lakh, while these countries have about 12 times as many, on a per capita basis. So the other point to keep in mind is, given the population and the population density, if we did not have a lockdown and if we had 60 to 70,000 cases in the month of April, given the fatality rates then, which were about 4%, now it's about incrementally about 1.2%. we would have been looking at easily 3,000 to 4,000 deaths a day. And then, we cannot do the arithmetic multiplied with the number of days and the number of deaths we would have been grieving at. So, in sum, the policy response of the government has been humane, taking into account the fact that GDP recovery, can happen and is indeed happening. The data is showing that, but lives that are lost cannot be brought back. That's been the underlying principle. And now, in terms of the evidence, if you look at whether it's the e-way bills, you look at cement production, steel production, railway freight, all these indicators are actually looking at around close to 90 to 95% of the pre-COVID levels, or even if you compare it to last year's levels. So after a very sharp decline during the lockdown, these have come back to to basically pre-COVID levels. That is what is the we, and so clearly the unlock phase has helped in bringing these indicators back. So a 23%, 23.9% decline is not because of the fundamentals of the economy for sure. It has to do with the lockdown, and the unlock phase is actually enabling us to recover.
Would you want to hazard a guess on how much of the 23.9% contraction is due to the hand of God, as COVID is described, and how much of it is due to fundamental reasons? Because the Indian economy has been facing a growth slowdown for almost 12 to 14 quarters before COVID struck us. So how much of it is due to this continuation of the fundamental slide in the economy, and how much of it is due to the hand of God, as you would like to say it?
So even on this, in the article, I again, put out data. So let's look at the data there. If you look at the index of industrial production, the output of 8 core sectors, cement production, electricity generation, exports, all these indicators were at their highest in the month of February of 2019, and for the first time had actually reached that peak after June 2019. And if you look at that chart, all these indicators were trending up. And then they actually had a sharp decline in the month of March. Why? Because again, if you go by the data, look at the Google Mobility Index. The Google Mobility Index fell by 20% in the month of March. And we all know very well that March is the last month of the financial year. It's a year where economic activity happens significantly. So if the COVID had not struck in the month of March, it's very clear that the growth rate that we would have had in the last quarter would have been much higher, and would have in fact been better than Q3 of last year. So this decline that was happening would have indeed gotten arrested, which makes me also put together with what I spoke about already, that India clearly lies on the line of fit on the intensity of lockdown. I would say, to a large extent, the decline is because of the severe exogenous shock that we faced, which is the COVID pandemic. One more point, which is important, that and some commentators have, for instance, made this observation that, because of the 23.9% decline, 1 quarter of GDP has been destroyed over the last 12 months. That is a very, very elementary error, which mixes up GDP as a flow and GDP as a stock. GDP is a flow variable. We do the comparison with the previous year only to take account of seasonality. So to say that there is a depletion in the stock is actually incorrect and makes an elementary error.
Yeah, point taken. I mean, that point is taken for sure. Getting back to your V-shaped recovery, how much of this rebound in demand that you're saying? You mentioned quite a few sectors which are on the mend and which are showing sharp uptrend. How much of it is due to pent-up demand? You've not been having people going out and spending for the last 4 or 5 months, and suddenly you opened up everything, and the economy is beginning to look up. People are also more optimistic. They're going out and spending on stuff which they would have spent in the last 3 months. So will that be, if that is the case, if it is pent-up demand, what happens to the recovery process come November, December, and when you head into the later part of Q3?
So see, firstly, obviously there is some impact of the pent-up demand, and that is what helps sentiment, that helps recovery as well. Going forward, what will be quite important is to ensure that the local lockdowns that are happening are actually minimized to the largest extent, because it's clear that the unlock phase has helped in the recovery. And if the local lockdowns do not happen, then I think we should be doing fine going forward. Of course, what you have to keep in mind, Raghu, is that this is a period of extreme uncertainty. A crisis that none of us has encountered before, and with an important distinction. Every crisis before, whether it was the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, originated from economic factors. In contrast, in this case, the crisis is from a health factor. The reason I bring that up is because consumption gets affected by uncertainty in a crisis, and that crisis itself had stemmed from economic factors in the previous crises. In this case, it is actually it's a pandemic. So that's an important distinction that we must keep in mind, and thereby incorporate that aspect as we go forward. One more point I will actually mention, which is, I think many of us seem to have generally, even commentators have shorter memories than desired. Go back to a period in following the Asian financial crisis. In 3 years, 2000, 2001, and 2002, we had growth rates of 3.8%, 4.8%, and 3.8%. Okay, so average growth for 3 years, that's 12 quarters, less than 4%. And yet that was basically not something that made us really reduce our potential growth rate. It was because of the exogenous shock at that time. What we did is very important, and actually there are important learnings. We did reforms then. Small scale sector, for instance, was liberalized at that time. A lot of disinvestment was done, and infrastructure was invested in. It's these reforms that basically then generated about 8% growth for the next year. In fact, almost the entire part of UPA1's growth was because of these reforms, because there weren't any reforms in UPA1 really. And you know very well that in an economy, the impact of measures are felt with large lags. And it's the same way now as well. We are doing reforms. The infrastructure pipeline is being pushed on. And in we are actually pushing on disinvestment as well. So those learnings are being incorporated. One final point: at the time when these measures were being taken in 2000, 2001, 2002, commentators did not appreciate it. We now look back, wistfully at that. When we actually have a historical perspective, mark my words, I think we'll be the same going forward as well. When these good things happen, oftentimes actually people don't take them into account, but look at it wistfully in history.
That's interesting. That's an interesting point. At this stage, I would like to put out a poll for the audience. Can we have the poll, please? Do you think the government is correct in its handling of the economy? That's a question. And I wanted this poll at the end of your first presentation, where you have spoken about what you've done and what you think is happening in the economy right now. So we will go on at the end of this to the second poll. Can we have that one as well, please?
That's a very interesting idea, I must say.
Okay, thank you. The second one is, when do you expect growth to get back to positive territory? I mean, in the light of what you heard the CA in the last 5-10 minutes, is it Q3 or Q4, or do you think it's going to be only in the next fiscal year, which is 21-22? So as we wait for the results, Subbu, I just wanted to ask you, you spoke about reforms. And one of your predecessors has gone on record recently in a written piece talking about fundamental reforms and how we are not pushing through with them despite what's happening now. In the last 2-3 months, we have seen some states tentatively pushing forward on reforms, especially on the labor front. But they've all been temporary, and they're with a time, they're with a time frame, and they're not open-ended, and they're only for newer investors and that kind of stuff. So, what are the kind of reforms that you think we need to do? Alternatively, I'll put the question in a different way. If you have to fuel the growth process from here onwards and support the recovery, what are the 3 things that you think the government should be doing?
So firstly, Raghu, I think it's important to recall, what the measures that have been taken. Firstly, on the agriculture side, the APMC reforms. It's quite important because despite 74 years of independence, the Indian farmer did not have the freedom to go and sell his produce where he wanted. And in fact, as my colleague Sanjeev Sanyal wrote after the APMC reforms, this has been there. These restrictions have been there since the time of Alauddin Khilji. So that long. So that's a very important piece of reform. Similarly, the Essential Commodities Act. In India, we have basically so far equated all storage to hoarding, and thereby infrastructure, whether it's warehouse infrastructure or storage infrastructure, has not come up, and thereby the food processing sector, for instance, has not developed at all because that requires storage and warehousing, etc. So the reforms that have been done on the agriculture side are, I think, very important. Similarly, the second piece of reform is actually important in terms of a statement of intent, especially given our socialist past. I think is very important. The statement on privatization, as you would recall, in the economic survey, we had shown how privatization leads to wealth creation. Now the government has clearly mentioned that except for a couple of strategic sectors, government will not have any business being in business, and that is to realize efficiency gains. Now, this is important because firstly, given our socialistic past, as I said, and the fact that despite almost 3 decades of liberalization, we were still basically being apologetic about using the word privatization. And in a country where the commanding heights of the economy had been given to the public sector, to now give the commanding heights of the economy to the private sector, it is a very important statement of intent, and which will be followed up as well. So these are 2 key reforms that I think I would highlight. The third is on, you specifically asked on labor. The 4 labor codes that are coming up, the code on wages has already been passed. The other 3 codes are actually in process. There are important changes that are happening there, especially on contractual employment, which will be very important because that will give the flexibility to the industry to be able to actually change the labor when demand conditions change, and at the same time also the compliance burden will be reduced significantly, because right now we have about 50 odd acts where the same definitions of wages, salaries, etc. they're given in multiple ways. By bringing them together and also reducing compliance burden a lot, there will be important changes, because a large part of compliance for firms, it actually comes from the labor laws, and so this is a very important set of reforms. There are several states, by the last count, about 15-16 states, which are also in the process of implementing these reforms. So collectively, when you put these together, again, like we are now looking at the 2000-2001 period, hopefully some commentator 15 years later will actually say that these were seminal reforms.
Great. Can we have the poll results, please? So opinion is equally divided on the handling of the economy. That's interesting. The second one. Okay. So majority of people watching this program now feel that recovery is at least positive territory is only the next fiscal. So thank you. That gives us an idea of the people's sentiment also, which is very important going forward, determining consumer behavior in the festive season. Coming back to what has been done in the last 5-6 months since the pandemic began by the government.
If you would just allow me to just quickly comment on the poll itself.
Yeah, sure, Subbu, sure.
I think the first one was especially interesting. It actually captures the uncertainty that is out there. I think there is no question that this is a severe exogenous shock. Just one simple factoid. If you look at the number of countries where GDP per capita is going to decline this year, it is the largest in 150 years. Once in a 1.5 century event. So that's the kind of pandemic that we are going through. It also relates to your earlier question about hand of God. When you have something that is happening once in 150 years, I think the answer is clear, and that is what is reflected also in that poll. It basically shows that uncertainty.
Of course, there's little doubt that you're in a very unenviable seat as of now. Whatever decisions you take can be questioned one way or the other. But, with some benefit of hindsight, I know it's unkind to ask a question with the benefit of hindsight, because decisions are taken based on prevailing circumstances, based on prevailing numbers and evidence. But one allegation or one impression of the government's handling of the crisis in the last 4-5 months is that it's been too conservative. It has been almost pre-decided that it'll play within the four walls of the budget and the budget numbers, and there's a hesitation to go out and borrow more and spend to fuel the recovery process. Dr. Raghuram Rajan, your predecessor as CEA and former Reserve Bank governor, in a recent piece has also said that it's when a patient is sick that he needs relief. No point in giving relief to a patient when he's atrophied. I mean, effectively saying that this is opinion that is prevalent amongst a large part of industrialists, from businessmen, economists, that the government has been very conservative, probably with an eye on fiscal deficit concerns or international rating agencies' pressures, whatever it is. Why is this hesitation to go out and borrow, if necessary, monetize the deficit even, and give relief to the economy now? And that brings me to the second question, which flows from this. When would be a right time to do that? I mean, is it the right time now? Is it already past, or is it coming in the future?
So Raghu, I think, of course, you were mentioning earlier about the hindsight versus decisions have to be taken with foresight. And it comes with the territory to be criticized with hindsight. And that's, I think that is something that we accept as part of our job profile as well. Now, there are two important points that I would actually bring to your attention. Let's just think from first principles here. GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Let's take out the X minus M, the net exports, basically consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. Let's net exports, leave that because not that much impact. And let's use that to then evaluate the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, which was 10% of GDP. If you look at every country, they basically used credit, they used liquidity, and they used fiscal measures, because they all realized very well that liquidity and credit also actually go and impact C, primarily in a crisis consumption, not as much investment, because private sector will not be that forthcoming to make investment in a crisis period. So that's why liquidity and credit was used. The same is true for India as well. Now, again, what we did is we actually recognized that where space is greater, we basically should be using that space more. Or in some sense, as Deng Xiaoping used to say, I don't care about the color of the cat as long as it goes and catches mice. So if the effect manifests through consumption, given in the form of liquidity or credit, or it is direct government spending, all that you finally care about is they have to aggregate together, and affect GDP. So that's point number one. Second point, and this is something, which Joseph Stiglitz wrote about, something that I have been saying and I've been observing in the data very carefully, is in any crisis, and I was referring to this as well, agents resort to what we economists call the precautionary motive to save. And the evidence of that, if you look at the PMJDY balances, during the lockdown, I was observing it every week. In the period of the lockdown, the balances increased by over 20,000 crores. Now, there are about 40 crore accounts, in PMJDY. Now, Raghu, you recognize very well that these are accounts at the bottom of the pyramid, where economists typically say the marginal propensity to consume is close to 1, which is basically saying that if this section gets 100 rupees as earnings, they typically go and spend the entire amount. Now, the fact that they were saving on average 500 rupees during this period, even now after the unlock phase, and I've been observing still the positive balances exist, to about 11,000, 12,000 odd crores, suggests the precautionary motive to save. It's also being seen in the deposit, amounts that is coming in the deposits. The point that I'm making here is that we have to be a little bit more careful, and that's what Joseph Stiglitz wrote about as well, calling into question some of the cash that is being given by other countries, saying, will it generate the bang for the buck? Even if you look at research in other countries where checks have been mailed to people, those checks have been used primarily for consuming essential items, not for durable consumption, not for discretionary consumption. This research is pointing out, basically the precautionary motive to save. What does that mean? When you take into account, just giving pure cash is not necessarily going to have the impact on consumption. We have to be a little bit more creative, focus directly on consumption of discretionary items. Here's where the infrastructure pipeline, pushing that becomes very important, because infrastructure, when activity happens, construction, picks up. That creates jobs in the informal sector and has lots of positive externalities, downstream, creates jobs and actually in many sectors, downstream benefits. So that's number one, because we already have the pipeline laid out, the projects are identified. Doubling down on that actually is, Second, the export PLI schemes, especially given the situation in China, companies wanting to move out, is also very important, because that is also something that will bring in investment, and thereby also foster consumption. So these are actually the measures that need to be done. What I'm saying is that unlike in other crises where cash could just be useful, here, because of the pandemic, people and this need for social distancing, it's possible that cash may just go and sit in bank accounts, which is not the intent. It's to further consumption. So these are important aspects that must be kept in mind, and the government has kept in mind as well. Last point, Raghu, and actually this is something which, see, when the pandemic started, we looked at the previous pandemic like this was a Spanish flu episode. And that happened 102 years back. That pandemic, the Spanish flu, lasted 2 years. What that actually told us is that this may not be a 3-month, 4-month phenomenon. It is something that actually may be longer than that. In fact, we are almost 6 months into the pandemic, and even now it's hard to say when will it actually, and that was also reflected in your second poll, the uncertainty related to that. So that is also important to keep in mind. So the government remains absolutely committed to doing, what is required, but at the same time, not, taking into account a longer horizon, which is what we actually may have to, take into account. That's part of being of policy making. We have to take in all inputs, assimilate and understand them, think rigorously about them, and then respond. Let me tell you that we actually are absolutely listening, and we are thinking very carefully with the best interest of the economy at heart.
So taking off from what you said about PMJDY accounts and how money is still, sitting there, about 11,000 crores at this point in time. So it clearly shows that people are not willing to spend. So unless people go out and spend, your consumption-driven growth is not going to be happening. Now, how does that fit in with your V-shaped recovery thesis? If people don't go out and spend, then how do we expect this rebound to sustain? Number one. And number two, is it time for a fiscal package? You attack the supply side of the problem in the initial months, as you rightly should have. Now, is it time to turn focus on the demand side to ensure that people go out and spend, and people don't remain in that mode of fear of the unknown, fear of the tomorrow, now that the economy has opened up again?
I think sorry, can you just give me a minute? There's some disturbance, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to respond to your question, your question, Raghu.
Yeah.
I think, Jenny, can you just quickly remind me the question, because I was.
What I was asking is, if money is sitting in the bank accounts and people are hesitant to spend, how do we? What is the basis for our optimism that recovery will happen based on people spending, consuming? That's the first question. And second is it time now for a fiscal package trying to attack the demand side, considering the support that you have given to supply all this time?
So firstly, Raghu, what I've said is that, looking at the indicators as of now, the recovery that has happened is, so many of these indicators are back to almost 90% of the pre-COVID levels. And I did mention that we have to actually continually monitor, because there is still residual uncertainty. I think on the consumption part, the part that actually continues to be something that we'll have to monitor is discretionary, and especially on the services side, those that require social distancing, because that is affected by the by the pandemic. And here's where the government's efforts to even bring in the Russian vaccine, enable phase 3 trials here, and then the other, the AstraZeneca vaccine as well, is critical, because it is important for all of us to be able to resume our normal lives, to be then for consumption across the board to come back. So I think that point is on the fiscal package. As I was responding to your earlier question as well, all I was saying was that we should be focusing more on targeting consumption directly and giving incentives for consumption. Just giving cash may not actually lead to consumption, but instead directly giving incentives for durable consumption may actually be far more effective in enabling consumption than by just giving cash transfers, which, by the way, has been done to the vulnerable sections of society.
Yeah, I have a few more questions, but unfortunately we're running short of time. So I'm going to now move on to reader questions, audience questions. We have quite a few excellent stuff coming in. There's this one from Mr. Lakshmi Narayan, founder of Cognizant. And his question is, successive governments have failed to meet disinvestment targets. In terms of market conditions, liquidity, investor sentiments, the disinvestment opportunity has been missed several times. What is stopping bold decision making here? And now comes the important part. If a Reliance group can mop up 20 times the disinvestment target in 20 weeks, with say even 2 years of preparation, why can't a bigger force like the government of India accomplish anything?
I will tie this with what I had mentioned earlier about the chapter on the economic survey that we wrote about privatization and wealth creation. We made this this point that privatization creates wealth, because private sector oftentimes is efficient, because the kind of questions that have to be answered from CAG, the CVC and all those others, which oftentimes can constrain decision making, are not as much there. So this is something we actually have to think about. If you look at the set of proposals that the cabinet has already approved for privatization, which is actually a reflection of the government's intent that has already happened. Now, the last mile, there is, and there are some aspects which we need to think about, which is, if you look at, for instance, some of the IPO, take the IRCTC IPO, which was oversubscribed, and had the first day listing was there was a good pop. This happens actually many times with private sector IPOs as well. But if, for instance, with the benefit of hindsight, questions are asked, and sometimes if suppose the a supposedly bad outcome is equated to, let's say, bad intent, then that can have an effect on decision making. Something that we need to think about actually in enabling an apparatus which sort of furthers decision making. The particular example that you're mentioning, that is primarily about decision being taken by one person, and which is different from what has to happen in a democracy with the necessary checks and balances.
Your point is taken, but I still the intent has always been there to disinvest, to privatize, and all the right noises have been made. But somewhere on the execution front, we have run into a wall. This year you went bold with the LIC IPO. What is the status on that now? Are we anywhere close to seeing that this year? Do you see it happening?
See, firstly, Raghu, I think, as we've been discussing, this is, of course, a very completely unanticipated shock, during the pandemic, with social distancing, and things have been impacted. So this year's targets actually, the achievement of those targets may be different from past years. But what I was highlighting is a broader aspect of the decision-making apparatus, which has to actually incorporate uncertainty into it, and thereby, not use hindsight to actually to keep inferring, to keep inferring bad intent, because that then generates risk aversion and has an impact on decision making. So that's the last mile that we have to enable, because clearly by the cabinet approving these, the political call has already been taken. So that's what I think we have to actually work on to enable privatization. But I think this is a short-term aspect that will get sorted out. Clearly, if you look at the long-term, statement of intent, it is about enabling the efficiencies in the private sector. I think that's something which will bring substantial rewards in productivity going forward.
So that brings us to the next question by Madan Sabnavis. Madan wants to know how big the fiscal deficit can get this year in the backdrop of whatever you said just now on privatization of LIC, which was a big item on the balance sheet of the government last year, not coming through. Where do you see the fiscal deficit this year?
No, Raghu, I've not said it's not coming through.
Okay, I get you. Okay. There is uncertainty on that.
Yeah, I've just said all I've said is that there is uncertainty on several economic fronts, and the same is reflected, in privatization as well. I think, it's at this point in time, it's very hard actually, given the uncertainty that we are facing, to be able to give a point estimate on this. We will basically, have to respond as necessary on the fiscal front to ensure that growth is taken care of. Because when we look at the evidence in the Indian context, and I actually again bring up the Asian financial crisis episode, for instance, because of the decline in growth from 2000 to 2002, actually debt to GDP rose, and above and beyond that, there was a fiscal push that was given. As a result, the debt to GDP went to 87%, which has been the peak so far. Yeah. But then growth came back. When growth came back, we had 8% growth for the next several years. Then the debt to GDP came back to 67%. So I think understanding this direction of causality, especially for a country like India with high growth potential, is really important. In advanced economies where the growth potential is 2.5%, the direction of causality from fiscal sustainability to growth may be both ways. But in the Indian context, it's very clear that when we get growth, we basically get debt sustainability as well. In fact, we've also seen, if you look at what we economists, macroeconomists track, the R minus G differential, the difference between the nominal rate of interest and the nominal rate of growth. For India, that differential on average has been about minus 4.3%, which means growth has been higher than the nominal rate of interest by about 4.3%. And when that is high, the debt becomes sustainable. So at this point in time, we must be focusing on growth, and thereby, that would be the right thing to do, in the medium term.
Super. So there's this very forward-looking question from Mr. Gopal Srinivasan. He says, as a nation that has so embraced digital payments, is this not the time to announce a digital fiat currency for India?
Gopal is a very good friend, and I'll have a longer conversation with him about these ideas. I think Gopal is, of course, advocating an idea which is quite germane. If we look at overall the retail financial transactions, have actually increased by almost 198% in the month of August, compared to last year. So this is another high frequency indicator. So, in my office tracks about 60 high frequency indicators on a weekly basis. So this is something. So clearly, COVID is providing a significant opportunity, for digitization of financial transactions. This is, of course, something that comes in the ambit of the banking regulator, and they should definitely be thinking about it. I will take this opportunity, Raghu, though, to actually say something broader about the financial sector itself. One of the things that clearly stands out is if you look at the global top 100 banks, India has only one bank in the global top 100, and that's a 55th ranked State Bank of India. This is for the 5th largest economy in the world. If you take China has 18 banks in the global top 100. Japan, when it was growing so fast, of the top 25 banks in the globe, globally, 18 banks were basically, Japanese. So in some sense, and I'll use a cricket parallel, our banking sector is like our 1990s cricket team, which used to win very well, at home, but did not have anything noteworthy to show, at a global level. So the banking sector actually should, imbibe the spirit of Mahendra Singh Dhoni's cricket team, which went and won abroad as well, be it the IPL, be it the 2020 trophy in South Africa, Champions Trophy in England, or the World Cup in India. So we need a banking sector that is actually, and a financial sector that is commensurate to the size of our economy, the 5th largest economy. That's a broader point I would actually make out of what Gopal has asked, because overall, when we look at OECD economies, credit penetration in India is by far the lowest, and which is something that we have to really work on and push.
There's this question from a common citizen. One was Sudha Menon, wants to know, when will the average citizen reach pre-COVID level of happiness and spending habits? When will they be able to spend freely without the fear of loss of income?
So I think, two observations. One, I think epidemiologists and doctors would be able to answer that question very well. But I will still hazard, giving an answer. It does depend on the vaccine arriving. Once we have the vaccine, then it'll be like a normal flu. And, once, we get inoculated, we can actually, so the pandemic will come in control, once the vaccine is there. That said, I also will, strike a note of optimism. This is based on some of my research in behavioral economics. If you read the excellent book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he talks about something called saliency bias, which all of us are subject to, which is, we basically overweight recent data. So when we are in normal times, we keep thinking we will continue in normal times. When we are in a pandemic like this, we keep thinking that this will continue. But the fact remains that this will also pass for sure. And we will get over this, and we'll get back to normal times. So about that, there is no doubt. It may be a few months down the line, or maybe 6 months, but it will happen.
You were talking about the banking sector while answering the last question. What do you want to say about what's the Damocles sword that's now hanging over the sector in terms of interest moratorium and interest on interest? The Supreme Court is sitting in judgment on that right now. But what are the options open to you in case the Supreme Court were to take an adverse view of the situation and banks are forced to give an interest moratorium as well?
So, the point that I was making, Raghu, about the banking sector is a much broader one. And, about the banking sector and the financial sector itself, looking at this as an opportunity rather than, and finding the opportunity in this crisis to leapfrog. So I think, that aspect is a of course an important part, but overall smaller element in a bigger mosaic of things that the banking sector needs to work on, which is to be able to lend credit at scale and large credit without having these periodic NPA problems. And here's where I actually will use one more example from sport. The only chess software that defeated the highest ELO rated player ever, Garry Kasparov, Deep Blue, was developed using artificial intelligence. And the reason I bring that up is the kind of tactics and strategy that is involved in chess. Those of us who have played chess will definitely vouch for that. Is far more complicated than the strategy or tactics that a defaulter uses. So if artificial intelligence enabled model can defeat the highest ELO rated player ever, I think there is no doubt that it can easily defeat the designs of any defaulter because it's far simpler. The point here being that this is, our banks should be thinking about actually technological leapfrogging. Even when we look at private sector banks, private sector banks also use data, analytics, etc., primarily for retail lending, not for large corporate lending. And that is where, this really needs to be looked at as an opportunity. And that's what I would focus on.
That's great. So I wanted to talk to you about quite a lot of other issues, including state finances and GST and other stuff. But obviously, you have only another 4 minutes left to go. So before you go, a personal question, the economic survey, I'm sure you started work on the next one already, is the personal signature of the chief economic advisor. So last year you had the one on ethical. What is it that you're looking at this year in the economic survey that's going to be Subbu's signature?
I think it's too early for me to, sort of open the curtains in that sense. We've been mulling over a bunch of stuff. So what I would like to do is, and that's something which has been an effort in the last two surveys as well, is to bring very rigorous research to answer questions, policy aspects that are really relevant for the Indian economy. For instance, in the July 2019, we looked at firm size, the dwarfs, the phenomenon of dwarfs. Also looked at behavioral economics and how that can really impact policy making. And in the current one, we actually looked at wealth creation, government intervention, cronyism, and issues like, even for instance, trying to measure inflation in a way that common people really understand using thali prices. So I would again, make an effort to try and capture that I keep the common person in mind. And this is partly, I think, a combination of my own training, at the University of Chicago, which basically makes you use data and rigor to actually answer policy-oriented questions, but also my own background. Actually, I come from a very humble background, and so I've actually, seen the lives of common people, which makes me always keep remembering Gandhiji's talisman about, remembering that most vulnerable person, keeping his face in mind while designing economic policy.
Yeah. And last. Okay, I'm not going to ask you anything more than this. Did you at any point of time in the last few months rue the fact that you left academia to get into policy making? Would you have been safer, happier in academia, commenting from the sidelines rather than being in the hot seat?
Well, I am someone who always loved challenges, really. In fact, I'm reminded again of another cricket parallel. One of the test match innings that I really, like is Rahul Dravid's innings at Edgbaston, with a swinging ball, which requires both technique and temperament. So, and, Rahul Dravid is someone I really admire as well for the selfless way in which he would contribute to the team. So I think I look at this as an opportunity to be, maybe a 1% of what Rahul Dravid did for cricket. Similarly, being in a position where, bringing in both technique and temperament to, to contribute, because of course these are tough times, and so apart from one's own knowledge, temperament also becomes important. So I think, I would, if given an opportunity again, rewind back to December 2018 and being told that this is what lies in store, I would still take it.
Excellent. That gives an insight into the person Subbu is. So thank you so much, Subbu. There were several other stuff that I wanted to talk to you about. Unfortunately, given the time constraints, we had over 100 questions coming in. I've been able to ask only 3 or 4. My apologies to those who have not been able to represent in this meeting now. And thank you once again. And for the benefit of our audience, the next edition of BusinessLine Knowledge Series will again be on the economy. This time it's on how to monsoon-proof the economy. And we have a panel of eminent people doing it. So please do join in next Friday. Thank you so much, Subbu. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.